Hello, welcome to this webinar presented by the Peter Jones Foundation. Today we're joined with Steve Wells, futurist, author, keynote speaker, founder of Informing Choices. Before we get into what's going to be covered in today's session, say hello in the chat box, say where you're watching from. You can use the chat box and the questions tab throughout. We've also got some polls, so take a look at those. We'll be coming to the polls at the end of each section, so take a look, consider your answers, and we will revisit. So a bit about the Peter Jones Foundation in this webinar series to start off with. So we are the Peter Jones Foundation, set up in 2005 by established businessman and star of Dragons den Peter Jones. We champion business, enterprise and entrepreneurship. And in our view, there's never been a more important time to champion entrepreneurship and to empower the next generation of business leaders. The economy is changing, what we expect from business is changing. And the way that we work and the world work is evolving quickly. So Steve's going to cover some of that in today's session. But our courses and qualifications said empower young people to start businesses, to change their lives. And we think they are the change makers of tomorrow. Steve joined us last year at EntFest, our Festival of Enterprise and Entrepreneurship. And some of you, I think, will have met him there. His insights are rich in value, really exciting. And we are so pleased to have him here today. So Steve, as I said, futurist, keynote speaker, full of wisdom, founder of Informing Choices, an insights business specializing in futures and foresight. His work is designed to help individuals, organizations, and event delegates make informed choices about the emerging future. So we're really looking forward to hearing how we can safeguard our success in business and in our own lives within the context of a post-pandemic future. So as I said, get your questions in the questions tab, have a look at the polls, and we'll come to them at the end of each section. So 3 sections, questions at the end of each. So start thinking. Steve, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to this. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Katie, and good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful day, isn't it? The way that our lives have changed over the last few months suggests that we should really be very happy when we get days like this. But it's easy to think maybe that these kind of days don't necessarily exist for us in the future, but I think they will. So what I would like to do for you today is just think about how our world is increasingly subject to significant change. We know that a lot of the changes that we're seeing, even through the pandemic, have been on trend. There are a number of things, a number of habits, a number of behaviors perhaps that are becoming normal that have been predicated on the back of the current pandemic. But let's bring all these together and just think about how our businesses and our enterprises can be sustainable into the future. So I'm going to do 3 things for you today. I want to explore 6 broad change forces. And we can really break these down into very small, very detailed pieces, but I'm going to be very broad with these 6 areas. What I want to do then is look at 4 examples of technologies that are really starting to challenge our ideas of existing business models. How can new technologies that we see emerging have a radical impact on the way that we think about business? And we need to think about those potential changes in order to create sustainable business in the future. What I want to do as a third part of this then is to start to think and reflect on what are the things that really make a difference when we start to think about sustainability. Is it about kind of the hardware, if you like, or is it about us as people and the attitudes, the leadership skills, the mindsets that we have, and how we take some of these things going forward into our businesses? So let's dive in. The first thing I think it's really important to understand is that a successful enterprise, in my opinion, operates across 3 time frames in parallel. Now, it's easy for me as a futurist to actually focus on the future, but actually it's really important that we win the race for the. It's important that we understand how to be operationally excellent and how to deliver against the commitments that we've made across our enterprises. So it's not just about the long-term future, it's understanding what it is to be in business now and to meet those commitments that we've made. Once a year, our organizations tend to take a bit of a step back and we kind of look out into the future. And we're trying to see what are the trends that we're identifying and how do we bring those back into the organization and the business to help us form new strategies, new ideas, to ensure that the work that we've done in the past can sustain our business into the future. And that period tends to be 1, 3, maybe 5 years. Typically, that's where we do the strategic planning. The third time frame, in my experience, tends to be a little bit rarer in organizations. Lift ourselves above the horizon so that we can take a really good look about not just what's in our immediate future, not what's just in our immediate attention, but beyond that, look at some of the weak signals coming through from the future. Now, that's not necessarily about understanding the activities, the actions we should take now, but it's actually about preparing us for things that we might feel uncomfortable or uncertain about. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that most of our organizations and enterprises put processes, systems, practice in place to give us a false sense of security about the future. The reality is, I think, we need to be prepared for it. And preparedness is one of the things that many people would argue was missing at the start of the pandemic, despite how many people were suggesting that a pandemic was inevitable. We just didn't know exactly what type of pandemic and when it would be. So preparedness, building some resilience and flexibility into what we do, is really what this foresight and futures piece is about. So let's start to take a look at these 6 areas of changes, of future forces. So the first is this notion that actually our world is incredibly complex. It's more complex and it's multifaceted. There are people at the moment talking about, well, is globalization exactly the same as it was before? We're seeing more blocks, more trading blocks, more of the bigger countries thinking about their own realm, their own areas of influence, and whether they should be just focused on their own countries or actually go beyond that. So globalization, I think, is likely to be really interesting going forward. And it may be one of those things that's changed by lockdowns across the world. We're seeing lots of different forces at play in terms of economy and trade. And obviously in the UK, we're in the middle of one of those at the moment as well, trying to understand what trade might look like in the future. Conflict and regional tensions still abound throughout the world. Technology is increasingly pervasive, but cybersecurity is a big issue. Now, at the moment, we're really relying on technology to help us generate some kind of familiarity in the lives that we're trying to live, be that our leisure lives or trying to keep work going. Some of the fallout from the lockdown has given us an insight into how we might handle the climate emergency, how we might reduce the emissions that help us think about the kind of implications of taking a different view on our impact on our environment. But all of these things, including our response to the pandemic, is helping us think about a notion of risk. And it's helping us think about the notion of uncertainty and how turbulent our world is. But we shouldn't lose sight of the opportunity that's represented by some of these factors. It gives us an opportunity to really take stock and implement changes that may create a much better life for all of us. So the second future force I'd like to share is about individuals shaping their own futures. And I guess those of us that have been in lockdown for a long period of time now can start to think about, well, what is it I'm interested in? How can I develop myself further? How can I increase my digital literacy? Because I've got a sense maybe that digitization is going to accelerate, that automation is going to be something that I'm going to be facing in the way that I do my job in the future. I think it also gives us the opportunity through some of these technologies to be curious, to try to understand how the world works, how different aspects work, what might be in our futures, what's the capability of some of these new technologies that we're seeing. I think these things also help us to be more open to new ideas, to experiment, to really help shape what we think is right for us in the future that we're starting to see. My third future force is emergence of new consumers. And this, I think, is really quite interesting because there are so many studies about how Gen Zs and Gen Ys are starting to have different needs, value brands in a different way, thinking about the proposition that brands offer them. And the sense is that actually everything we're doing is about those generations. But what's interesting is the economic power probably resides still with older generations. So perhaps the thing to think about is, how do you broaden the proposition that you have across multiple generations? I quite often use the example of my mother when I start to think about these kind of emerging new older consumers, because I've always kind of handed on to her computers that I don't need anymore. But what she's done is she'd skipped the computer for booking her travel when we were able to do that, and her shopping, and she does it all from her mobile device. So it's a really interesting idea, and just a very small snapshot about how consumers' views, not just of technology, but how you can use technology to access the things that you need, is changing across all generations. When you then factor in how family structures, how migration patterns, and how diversity and inclusion are changing, then it's really important that if we're looking to be sustainable in the future as a business, that we're absolutely about our consumers and about the changing nature of consumers across all age ranges. Now, I've touched on it once or twice already, but the fourth force that I want to think about is exponential technology development. And for me, this is one of the biggest factors that I see in our future. And people sometimes challenge me to say, well, we've had industrial revolutions in the past. And it's true. Whether it's the introduction of the steam engine, the creation and invention of electricity, the impact of production lines, desktop computing. But for me, I think many of those inventions, those creations, happened in reasonable isolation. So let's just take a second to think about where we are now. And where we are now is a world that's seeing the introduction of 3D printing, of 4D printing, of materials that can change their properties, that can self-heal, of robotics and drones, of human enhancement, synthetic biology, the use of blockchains, immersive technologies like virtual augmented reality, quantum computing, atomically precise manufacturing, nanotechnology, and the one technology that I think brings all those together, artificial intelligence. That technological backdrop is so different to anything that we've seen in the past that I think it's a critical force for the future. And I think our role is to not only understand how these technologies fit into our enterprises, but also how we think about those technologies being used, implemented, designed, developed for the good of all humanity going forward. Because unless we've got a very human future, then it's difficult to understand how we can have a very sustainable business backdrop as well. I think the two go really nicely together. The fifth one I wanted to think about is this notion of two worlds colliding. So what do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, we have what I think of as an analog world. In an analog world, when we're used to physical things, we make cars, we own houses, we have white goods in our houses. We have a particular fondness for owning certain types of asset. Now, we're used to thinking about technology, but that technology is a tool. And sometimes we use it, sometimes we don't. But it's not necessarily the first thing we think about when we look at a particular issue. So that's our analog world. But our digital world that's coming together with that analog world is really challenging our notion of where value is. Is value in the products and services that we create, or is it in the data that we collect? And increasingly, it's more about the information and more about how we can use data to unlock this world of new possibility. So people that are digital, they're kind of born digital. They're born into households that have computing, that are used to social media, that are used to doing things across the web. So this world is a very different world, and it's a world that's really starting to challenge what we think of as value in our enterprises. And for me, the force that brings all these things together and focuses very much on sustainability is this one. Will sustainability become a license to operate? And I really think it will. And I know lots of people use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but I think they're an absolutely brilliant template through which to look at how our enterprises, our businesses impact on the world in which we live and work. So sustainability, I think, for many people used to be about climate change. It used to be about biodiversity, so protecting the planet. But actually, sustainability is more complex than that. It's about sustaining our social structures. It's about sustaining humanity. It's about growing access for those billions of people that don't have access to those things that are familiar to us. So looking at ensuring we have good quality education, looking to ensure that we have gender equality, looking to eradicate hunger and poverty, but doing that through the creation of sustainable economics, sustainable businesses, sustainable enterprises, so that the economics and the way that our societies are funded also comes through the successful businesses, so that we can provide healthcare in the way that we like to do in the UK. So sustainable businesses and a license to operate, I think, is going to be critical. When I start to play with kind of scenarios and foresight, I can actually see how this could become a framework for the way that we tax businesses in the future. So as a big enterprise, what is the enterprise's carbon footprint? How does that enterprise treat people? Also in the local ecosystem? How is it supporting education? How is it being a good corporate citizen? How does it create and fund pensions for the future? All those kind of issues could dictate how much tax is paid, including how fully we automate the enterprise. And it's interesting, isn't it, how we think about some of the tax controversy with the big tech companies, the likes of Amazon and Google and Facebook, and where and how they're taxed. Then this kind of template could change that notion of taxation for those big tech companies as well. Food for thought. So having taken that run through the 6 forces of change, we've come to our first poll. And I'd like you to tell us through the poll which future change force do you anticipate having the greatest impact in the next 5 years? Is it that idea of a more complex, multifaceted world? Is it individuals shaping their own futures? Is it the idea of new consumers emerging? Is it the exponential technology development we see? Or is it this two worlds colliding where data can unlock a new future? Or is it sustainability as a license to operate? Katie, can you take us through the poll, please?
So what people are looking at is it's all of the above, intrinsically linked at 56%. And then everything else kind of comes to quite a sort of a dead heat. The rest of the weighting is split between them, but with no one favouring a more complex, multifaceted world. So what do you think about that? Are they all intrinsically linked?
I mean, I think that's really quite interesting, because one of the things that I think of when I look into the future and you know, we create scenarios, I think the connectivity between these things is absolutely crucial. And quite often we kind of put the blinkers on when we think about a particular issue. And we might think about the technology, and we go, wow, this artificial intelligence, it's really cool, isn't it? Look at what we can do with robots nowadays. Think about autonomous cars. And we don't necessarily think about the implications of those things across wider society. So I think the connectivity between those is actually really critically important. And it's hard sometimes, I think, for me to understand how we do one of those things without the others.
And I think it's something to kind of bear in mind as well. When we think about sustainability, I think it's now being used a lot to kind of almost talk about eco-consciousness, whereas actually sustainability is longevity. And I think that's when we think about how these things all connect together, it's building a future-proof company that can exist and be agile and nimble and pivot to the changes that we might see in 10, 20, 30 years' time. So, Steve, we've got some questions. Thank you for submitting them. I'm
Cool.
going to start with one from Joel Brevet, who you will have met at Entfest last year.
I do. Hi, Joe.
So Joel says, technology isn't inherently bad, but as long as the actors in control of technology are able to wield the data to manipulate populations, don't we have a potential social crisis bigger than this pandemic looming for us?
Excuse me. Well, that's a really interesting perspective, Joel. And increasingly, we're seeing that. I'm sorry, did I drop out then?
No. Still hear you.
Okay. Increasingly, we're seeing people talk about, or we're hearing people talk about the ethics of technology development. But one of the things that I think does happen is we take quite a localized view about what's good and what's bad. So let's just take the example of weaponizing artificial intelligence, because there's general acceptance that it would be sensible for the globe to come to some kind of agreement about when we stop weaponizing artificial intelligence. So completely autonomous targeting, for example. But I think what tends to happen with these things is that each country takes their own view about when they've reached a certain level of technology that they would then feel comfortable stopping at. So you get to this place, and if we use nuclear weapons as an interesting kind of case study almost, then what we found it was at the point we got to mutually assured destruction, we thought actually now's a really good time to work out how we should control this. And it kind of feels there's almost a human behavioral piece in this, which is around the tipping point. When is it the development of artificial intelligence becomes too dangerous? And I suppose the issue here is that it's not necessarily in the control of government, it's in the control of corporations. And that's one of the things for me that differentiates the potential of artificial intelligence to be used for bad from nuclear weapons. At least nuclear weapons were in the gift of government states. But I think it is a really interesting issue, and I think it's questions like this at events like this that help ensure there's an ongoing public debate about what feels right around the balance between governance and guidance in how technologies like AI are developed.
Absolutely. And this is a question I really like from Dean, but it will bring me onto the pit. Steve and I were talking before the webinar started, and I was trying to remember what Tobias Lutke, the founder of Shopify, said about remote working, which is what Dean's question is about. And he said we're currently operating in a kind of 2030 world with 2020 technology, which is why it sometimes feels kind of fragmented and complex. But this is the state of the world that was always going to happen, but we just don't have the technology to handle it. So Dean's question is, do you see the way that we're all having to work at the moment having an everlasting impact on the way that we work on a day-to-day basis from now onwards?
Thanks for the question, Dean. That's really interesting. And the reason it's really interesting was I was giving a presentation last evening, and that's one of the things that I specifically covered. So as I said at the start, a lot of the things that we're doing right now during the lockdown and through the pandemic have been on trend, and the pandemic has kind of accelerated them. So I think working from home is going to be something that's with us to a much greater extent once we're through the pandemic than it was before. And the way that I think that may manifest itself is through companies and enterprises deciding that actually it's cheaper and more efficient to help the employees ensure they have the appropriate connectivity and the appropriate devices at home in order to save them having to commute into the office. Now, if we kind of extrapolate that and think about, excuse me, how big that might get in the world of work, then does that start, here are a series of questions now, does it start to impact how often and the number of times we'll commute, for example, into London? So all the infrastructure that we've been putting in place to increase the movement of people into London, is that absolutely necessary in a world where many more people will be working from home? The other implication is on the development of real estate in London. How much of real estate development in London and other towns and cities is actually about office accommodation? Or what do we do if all of a sudden we don't need half of that? So I think there are some really interesting longer term issues around not just how we work and whether we can continue to be efficient and effective enterprises, but actually the structures and the approaches that we have and that we've become used to in how we travel, where we work, and potentially looking to repurpose some of those assets so that we can still continue to use them, so that they're part of a sustainable future as well.
Brilliant. And I think that actually some of these other questions that we can come back to at the end of the next section, but I might just cover this one from Chris beforehand. So Chris has said, drone delivery has taken off, no pun intended, in the developing world such as Africa, but has yet to take hold in the UK and the US. Will the kind of the NIMBY, the not in my backyard mindset in the UK prevent overall development in our country?
Yeah, really good question, and I have every belief that the pun was nothing but intended. So drones are a really interesting one, and when we look particularly at Africa, we see creativity and innovation about the use of existing technologies because there's less legacy infrastructure to hold them back. So some of the banking applications and the way that mobile devices are used for bank transactions in the likes of Africa, particularly in East Africa and Kenya, then we actually see how rapidly that technology has penetrated that particular part of the economy. So at the moment, if we then try to put drones into the middle of a busy city, we don't necessarily want drones falling out of the sky. We don't necessarily want bigger drones interfering with air traffic. We don't necessarily want drones interfering with some of the other infrastructure that we might have in place. So we do have to be careful about how we bring those into use. The notion of drones, I think, is much bigger than we quite often think. So on the one hand, we've got drones that might deliver your pizza. On the other hand, we've got autonomous drones that might deliver you to a helipad on the banks of the Thames so that you can make your trip to Heathrow Airport or whatever. So the notion of drones and how they're regulated, I think, becomes more important in a more densely populated country. So it's looking really at where you use them, how do you use them, how do you embed them into the existing infrastructure, and what are the appropriate regulations to ensure that we keep everyone safe. And if we're worried, or if we're concerned at the moment about how that might, how guidance and governance might actually stop the progress, then just imagine as you take off from Gatwick Airport and your aircraft runs into a drone, and what the implications might be. So we've already seen how the interference of air traffic movements by relatively small drones can have a really big effect on aviation. So I think realistically, we do have to be careful about the regulatory regime we put in place.
And with that kind of conversation about kind of countries with less established kind of technology infrastructures being able to kind of pivot faster and adapt more quickly, do you think that plays out in kind of the economies, kind of the big economies of the West in general? So do you think in the UK that we'll be inhibited from moving and adapting to kind of some of the changes that we expect to see in the future as quickly as kind of counterparts in other parts of the world, because we are set in our ways and it's much harder to kind of move? We're less nimble, less agile, and there's more to unpick.
There are two examples immediately came to mind, and I wouldn't say they were necessarily small infrastructure projects, but HS2 and Heathrow's third runway.
Yeah.
So there are regulations are in place for a reason. Regulations are in place to protect people, to protect livelihoods, to protect the environment. So we do have some very cumbersome. That's before we get into the not in my backyard kind of people. Now, if you look at other countries where they have much more space, they can be much more flexible about how they think about those things. So if we look at the number of new airport developments in China, then actually you wonder, why on earth can't we be like that? Well, I suppose there are two things there. One is space, and the other is a dictatorship as a government that's not answerable to the population every 5 years. So, you do have these differences that can play out in different countries with different governance and governments and government types. So we do need to be cognizant, I think, of where we are in the UK, what's in place, why it's in place. And it's in place in order to help us get the right balance between progress and some kind of accountability about what that might mean and how it might be implemented.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to hand back over to you, Steve, but please continue to visit the polls and type in the questions tab, and we're going to go on to the next section.
Business. And I want to start with this idea of bringing together artificial intelligence and blockchain in an autonomous vehicle. And let's focus on autonomous cars. Let's imagine that this autonomous car is 3D printed from materials that can self-repair. The car might be self-owning, so it sits on the blockchain, you subscribe to the service and you call the car whenever you want to use it. It's so reliable that it's self-insuring. Accidents are almost a completely a thing of the past. So what does that change? Well, it changes our need to actually own cars. It changes the way that cars are actually produced. If they're self-repairing, they can decide, first of all, if the repair can be managed through the self-healing materials that it's constructed from, or that it needs to pre-book itself into a repair shop in order for a particular component to be replaced, because it knows from the data that it's analyzed that it's got about 150 more miles in it. So the idea that actually we have cars produced in the same way that we do now, and those assets, when they are produced, are available in the same way as they are now, is really challenged by this idea. But not just the car production itself, but the funding of it and the insurance. So this kind of second and third order effects of some of these technologies are really important to keep in mind when we start to think about how business and enterprise might change of certain sectors in the future. There are some really simple processes that we've undergone in the past. So let's take the example where we turn up at a hotel reception. And you know the process that we go through. We say hello, we have our credit card, we ask for some specifics and so forth. And the person behind the desk is all very nice to us and offers this kind of personal one-to-one service that we really enjoy. Well, what about this as an option? What about going to a hotel and actually we have a choice of, let's call them people for now, that we can interact with when we check in. We could check in with a robot that kind of looks like a robot from our imagination, because, you know, we know that robots are fairly clunky, they're metallic and they're relatively square and so forth. Alternatively, we could be checked in by a sort of a humanoid looking robot, the kind of things that we're starting to see emerge on the market right now. Or in by a velociraptor. Now, what's interesting about this example is it actually exists in a theme park hotel in Japan right now. Audience that would scream back at me, and I was to ask you, which do you imagine would be the most popular check-in desk? Then I'm sure you would all scream back at me, the velociraptor, because given the choice of the three, who wouldn't want to have a conversation with a dinosaur? So the idea here that we can change through the use of technology, in this case robotics and artificial intelligence, we can change something so relatively simple is really quite interesting, isn't it? Because we start to introduce through the use of technology a new experience. Let's look at another example. Immersive technologies have been around for quite a few years. So if we think about virtual and augmented reality, the one example that I often cite here is the use of Second Life. Second Life is a virtual world where you can trade products and services. Now, whilst it's on the wane a bit now, at its peak, the internal economy of Second World was worth $500 million. That's the trading of entirely virtual goods and services, creating real money. So the idea that for entertainment, we can think about our experiences in a really different way, that we can engage in a wholly virtual world, is really quite interesting, isn't it? We start to think about how those technologies are starting to evolve now. We're getting to the point where actually we can use them to help us make other decisions in our lives. So let's take the example of a trip abroad, maybe to an exotic resort in Southeast Asia. So I go to the travel agent and I say, I'm interested in traveling to this place. What they may be able to do is to help me experience things before I even book the ticket. So maybe through the use of immersive technologies, I can taste the food from the hotel. I can feel the quality of the bed linen. I can even smell the fragrances in the bathroom. If I wanted to take a trip to Kenya for a safari, I could actually feel the wind of the Serengeti on my face. I can hear the roar of the lion. All these technologies could enable me to make the choice before I ever step foot on a plane. We're already seeing many of these technologies used, for example, in complex maintenance tasks. So the wiring network in an airliner, for example, we can use augmented reality to ensure that when we're cutting the wire, we're cutting the right wire, so we understand the maintenance task ahead of us. So immersive technologies, I think, are really going to change the way that we interact at a whole number of different levels, not just gaming, but other areas of enterprise and business as well. We've already touched on 3D printing and 3D printing in the automotive, but I really like this example because I think it really illustrates the potential of these technologies. So these two cars are 3D printed. They're both electrically powered. The car on the left-hand side there, the Strati, was the prototype. It was created from about 50 components, totally 3D printed. And the idea is that if you create cars that are 3D printed, electrically powered, you can return a profit from about 2,500 units through a micro factory. Now, on the face of it, that sounds really good. And by the way, the car on the right-hand side is a production model. It's available now. But this gets really interesting when you start to think about some of the other implications of this. It's so much cheaper to produce a 3D printed car than a conventional car. A conventional car might have up to 10,000 individual components. This 3D printed car can have between 50 and say 75. So you then start to think, what happens to the component supply chain? How short is that component supply chain that we need to produce a car from 50 or 75 different components rather than 10,000? Cars are much cheaper to develop, to research. That gives you the opportunity to create a platform for 3D printed cars. The other thing is, if we have a series of micro factories across a particular geography, then we don't need to ship cars from a global plant all over the world. We can produce them locally. So the idea of a 3D printed car in a micro factory doesn't just change the motor manufacturing, the motor automotive manufacturing itself. It also changes aspects of the supply chain for components. It also changes the infrastructure required for export and import, the logistics. So the point that I made earlier on about how radically different we might see future technology changing existing industry sectors, I think it's really important that we understand the second and third order impacts of these changes. So we've looked at a number of different technologies here. We've looked at artificial intelligence. We've looked at blockchain. We've looked at 3D printing, the use of materials that can change their properties. We've looked at robotics and how not only do these technologies change manufacturing, but they also change how we as people can experience things differently. So let's go to our second poll. Now, the last time we did this, I disappeared for a few seconds. Hopefully, I'll hang on to the side of the poll.
And I will read out the right poll this time, which has actually changed slightly, which is interesting. So now 65% of people think artificial intelligence is going to have the biggest impact, with 3D printing coming in at second at 30%, augmented and virtual reality at 20%, and then 5% between the others: blockchain, robots, chatbots, other. I kind of asked the question in the chat box, and I'd love to hear what everyone's got to say. You know, which of these technologies have you already experienced in your own lives? You know, did that inform your decision whilst you were talking in the poll? I think we've all had maybe some interaction with these things without knowing it, but are they the kind of answers that you expected, Steve? That artificial reality, artificial intelligence would come out top?
I'm sorry, Katie, can you just repeat
Yeah,
that
of
last
course.
bit of the question?
So
I just missed it.
is 60% of people said, 67% of people said artificial intelligence, they thought it would have the greatest impact. Is that what you would expect, that artificial intelligence kind of tops that list?
Yes, I think I would. I think I would expect that for one particular reason. And one, artificial intelligence seems to be the technology that has everyone's imagination stimulated. If you think about the last 3 years and how often through the lay media we've seen stories about artificial intelligence, both how good it can be, but also how potentially bad it could be. So the fact that it's there, it's developing at such a rate, it's constantly creating news stories, I think is one of the reasons why it's in the public consciousness. I think we need to make sure that we keep the right kind of balance on the development of artificial intelligence. So at the moment we're seeing kind of three broad areas: robotic process automation, which is where we can take a task performed by a person and make it quicker, faster, more accurate through the use of artificial intelligence. The other is a kind of a context aware, which tends to be using call screening at call centers. So by the nature of the question, the query can be processed in a slightly different way, for example. And the third is kind of expert. So the expert is very narrow and very deep. And that's the kind that we see machine learning helping artificial intelligence, for example, where we provide a series of learning rules and the application teaches itself a certain a certain skill. And we've seen that applied not only there, but also in the way that IBM's Watson can diagnose cancer. So that's where we are at the moment. We're a long way still from artificial general intelligence, where a particular one artificially intelligent device can work across all those domains and actually be smarter than people.
Yes. Oh, I mean, I think it's terrifying and exciting at the same time. And I think that it's, we hear, it's a danger, we hear snippets in the press, and I think it perpetuates fears rather than alleviates them. And I think that there is a fear of the new with lots of these technologies. But what we are seeing, and I like Palm's answer about the experience of these technologies that they've already had, is that 3D printing and adaptive manufacturing. And that's something which people have been celebrating during these kind of COVID-19 times. We've seen lots of young people that we've worked with actually turn their talents to produce PPE visors, to kind of do a lot of that work with the equipment that they have. And it's using the technology that we're seeing to make cars in a much more at-home, small business and enterprise way. So perhaps some of these technologies are more easily adopted by the general public and business owners than others.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, and we'll come on to it perhaps in a bit more detail in the last section. But I think the creativity in innovation has actually been about the use of existing technologies for a new cause right now. But even if we look at bigger enterprise, if we look at how quickly people have been able to switch research, development, and production to ventilators, or higher capacity creation of different types of PPE. So the ability for big enterprise as well as small enterprise to be flexible has really come to the fore during the pandemic. And it's interesting how stuck we tend to be in our ways, even through the use of technology, until some kind of external force forces us to change what we believe is possible. And I think that's a really, really important mindset thing. And as I say, we'll come on to talk about that in the last section.
So I'm going to go just to a couple of questions in the questions tab. And I'm going to ask this one from Bill Newhead. And this is kind of more general about the future, what we can expect in the future of business. So is it going to get worse before it gets better? Do you feel it will be our kids' kids that will benefit from the huge changes ahead, whilst Gen Z, so those born after 1997, will bear the brunt of the challenges inherent in transitioning?
Thanks for the question, Bill. I think the pandemic has the potential to change almost everything. If we think about the way that generally the response has brought together technology, attitude, behaviors, and a more socially responsible perspective on how we fund people and what they need in order to function at a certain level, then it really does look as if it could be the tipping point for us to truly consider people and society at the heart of what we do. So if we think about ideas of universal basic income, universal basic service, so the concept of universal basics, it's people have been talking about it for years. Now all of a sudden it's actually something that is plausible, and I don't think many economies have considered it very plausible. But right now, it's sort of been the only way we've been able to keep society functioning. So this is where foresight is so critically important. So what does the world look like after the pandemic if actually what we've done is gone back to what we're familiar with? So if we always do what we've always done, actually we'll probably always get what we've always got. And part of what we've always got is kind of social disagreement. We've got disparity between those that have and those that have not. We've got a disparity between those that access technologies in order that they can continue to learn from home and those that can't. Or we can think about a future where what we do is we take the lessons from what we've seen and think holistically about how society, including how enterprise operates, should change in the future. How should we fund a different perspective on the welfare state? Should we actually stop calling it the welfare state and call it something different? How do we ensure that we not only keep people at the front of mind when we think about the development of new technologies, but how do we do that in a way that continues to reward innovation? So I think it does represent a really interesting opportunity to create, and I hate the phrase, the new normal. I say I hate the phrase, but I do use it myself. But you know what I mean. It's creating something different. It's looking at what's happened in the pandemic and using the technologies and the things that we see to inform new mindsets, new behaviors, new ways of leading, if you like, to take us into the future.
I think it's so interesting. And I think I've got a question which I'm going to come back to at the end of the next section, but I'd like to put it to the audience if you don't mind. And I think I would like to ask people what businesses they think are going to evolve and emerge from this current situation. Where do you think the new opportunity areas are? If a young person was going to set up a business now, where would that business be? What would you encourage? Where are the kind of gaps in the market that you're looking to be filled? I think it'll be a really interesting thing to kind of talk about a bit later on. But before then, Steve, I'm going to hand back over to you. And thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Katie. So far what we've done, we've looked at these forces for change. We've identified how we think some technologies might create different business opportunities, different business concepts. So I want to get into what I think is actually the critical issue, because the technology is an enabler, technology is a tool. The forces for change are things that sort of happen around us, but happen as a response to us as humans. So the issue for me is, how do we think about leadership, not leaders, but leadership in this changing world? And I think it really starts here. And it starts around, this is linked to notions around wicked problems. Because if we believe that our world is changing at ever greater pace, it's becoming ever more complex, then that means we tend to be much less certain about how the external environment will evolve. And the last couple of minutes, I think, have really emphasized that we don't know how things will evolve. So there's less certainty about that. I think we have less consensus about how it will evolve as well. So we're kind of far from agreement and we're far from certain. And that's where I think we require this notion of extraordinary leadership. And I'll drill down into a little bit more detail shortly about what I mean by that. The reason I think that's important is because typically the kind of always do what we've always done piece is in this ordinary management portion, because we've tended to be close to agreement about how we make sense of what's going on and how we change. And we've been reasonably certain because the pace of change has been a little bit more pedestrian in the past. So we can make more sense of that. It tends to be, kind of almost baby steps. Whereas what the change we're seeing now, I think, is giant leaps. And we have to think about that in the context of leadership in a different way than maybe we've done in the past. And actually, it's an issue of mindset, and that sets up a mindset challenge. And the mind challenge within our existing organizations, I think, is about changing our DNA, because most of us in existing enterprises have a DNA that's kind of hardwired to think about playing by the rules of the game, doing what we've always done so we'll get the success that we've always got. But I don't think that's sustainable anymore. The pace, the scale of change, let's just think about the things we've seen changing through the pandemic, means that we need to think about creating a new game, creating a new set of rules. And what's interesting for me about that is, I think if we have an entrepreneurial mindset, if we're thinking about a new enterprise idea, that kind of new game, new ideas, new rules is built into our thinking. It's built into the way that Uber didn't want to be a taxi firm, but wanted to be a data firm. And the same is true of the likes of Airbnb. I think the challenge is, if we're a big, successful organization, how do we shed ourselves of the stuff that's been successful for us in the past? So if we were Kodak, do we really want to challenge our existing business model with this nice, shiny digital camera we've just invented? Do we really want to pay attention to a new competitor from Japan coming into our market? So the choices that we have, they're about mindset. And we need to be really clear what mindset we're adopting when we're thinking about some of these challenges and opportunities that lay ahead of us. Now, I've spoken about this idea of extraordinary leadership, and here are a few things that I think about when I think about extraordinary leadership. And I think the first one is the headline here. It's actually about developing skills that help us stay more human, because the trend of automation is only going to be accelerated, I'd argue, through the pandemic. So the very thing that we think technology and automation might take away is actually the thing that differentiates what we do through our enterprises. It's how we form relationships. It's how we stay human. It's those bits of creativity, of innovation, of caring that actually are much harder to automate. So this is about building mindsets and capability so that we can imagine and experiment our way into the future. And some of the things that I think are critical in this area about how we learn in an accelerated way, and how we continue to remain curious throughout all of our lives. How we increase our awareness, our self-awareness about how we project ourselves, our ideas, how we interact with people. How we use emotional sensitivity, both in work but out of work. If we're leading people inside an organization, then this uncertainty through automation is something we're going to have to be really good at explaining, really empathetic with the people inside our organizations. I'm sure for this audience, I don't need to focus too much on entrepreneurship, but that's absolutely crucial. It's not necessarily just about the enterprise, just about business, just about commerce. It's about being entrepreneurial on the way that we lead, the behaviors that we exhibit. I then think there are another set of skills around how we use foresight, how we put what we understand and the insight that we have in the context of what we're doing right now and how we move to a different future. We do have to be more tolerant to uncertainty, because uncertainty is our new reality. It's always been our reality, maybe. But I think the current situation has really just accelerated our sense of uncertainty. So not only do we need to be really good at understanding it, we need to be really good at explaining uncertainty to people inside our organizations. So scenario thinking, problem solving, taking a much broader, a systems perspective. And I spoke a little bit about that when we were looking at those 3D printed car examples. What are the other implications that we see beyond just the direct connections? So the idea that actually technology is going to help us through this, I think is false. We need to remember that technology is the tool, and the difference is actually what we make as people with our mindset, the skills that we employ, and the way that we think and interact with other people. Critical to this, I think, is digital literacy. And when I talk about digital literacy, if I can say it, is not that it's necessary for everyone to understand how to code. It's actually necessary for people to be able to ask the right questions. What is artificial intelligence capable of? What do we mean by robotic process automation? What are the kind of things in what my organization is doing right now could robotic process automation replace? It's asking the right questions. We don't need everyone to be an expert. We do need everyone to be informed. One of the things I think that is going to be absolutely critical going forward is education and training systems. And what's fascinating through the current pandemic is the ability of schools, colleges, universities to really innovate through the technology to ensure that learning can happen. Now, as I alluded to earlier on, there are some social challenges to doing that, making sure that everyone that's of an age to learn has access to the right connectivity and the right kind of devices. It takes new ways of creating learning material, and it takes a new mindset to adapt to those learning ideas. And part of what we need to be able to do is to create a sense of community and social cohesion around those new learning methodologies as well. I think we also need to learn new things. We don't necessarily need to learn some of the technical things we've done in the past because they can be automated. It's the kind of, if you're as old as me, the debate about whether you should be allowed a calculator in a mathematics exam. It's actually about learning the things that will differentiate us in the future, because kids going into school now will have to work in the environment in 20 years' time, not the one we have now. And arguably, school is preparing kids even as young as 5 and 6 to work in the world that we see now. There are some assumptions around that suggest maybe 2/3 of kids that enter primary school right now will work in jobs that don't exist at the moment. So that gives you some kind of sense about how rapidly I think education needs to change in order to ensure we have people ready to work in the future and ready to think about those things that differentiate our products and services. And that's the really human piece. And I want to go back at this point to what we're seeing in the pandemic at the moment, because we've got really used to thinking about the key workers, what the key workers do, and we applaud them every Thursday evening. But what's interesting is many of those key worker jobs are the very jobs that are hardest to automate. So maybe we'll see the value, we should see the value of those jobs in the future increase. I've started to talk about the world of work there, and rethinking work and employer responsibilities I think is critically important. So the way that we supervise people if we're working remotely is going to change. We do have the technology already to really closely monitor what we do. I know there are some companies that offer chip implants so that you can access the building and the employer can monitor where you go at work, how productive you're being. Other technologies will allow employers to monitor the keystrokes on your keyboard to ensure that you're being productive. So some of those approaches, I think, are likely to change as we create more of a trusting relationship between employer and employees. That trusting relationship may have to extend to preparing people for working outside the organization if more of what we do inside is going to be automated. So that support mechanism may change, and it may be legally incumbent upon us in the future to ensure that we move people out of the organization in a way that reskills them for something they want to do in another role. But equally, it's the way that we use data, and we use technology that the technology created through the use of data that helps us perhaps supervise people. We need to ensure that we have that information secured, and we are trusted to look after our employees' data. I think this other area is going to be critically important as well, and that's how we establish robust technology ethics. And there are two issues here. One is it right to develop the technology that we're developing? In the past, we may have asked the question, can we develop a technology to perform a certain task? Perhaps increasingly the question is, should we develop a technology to undertake a specific task? And the other aspect of this is, how do we think about our leadership within an environment that's almost entirely automated. So if we go far enough into the future, what if my boss is an artificially intelligent robot? What if half my staff are intelligent robots? What if they don't need holidays? How do I respond when the job that I want in the organization is also being sought by a robotic colleague? So there are some really interesting future challenges for us to think about in our workplaces. So Katie, over to you for the final poll and questions.
Perfect. So I think this is one of the most interesting kind of polls that we've had, because it is much closer than the others. So the kind of critical changes that we need to make are kind of, the top one is rapidly adopt new skills through education and training. I think that's where people now are feeling, it has exacerbated that feeling of feeling left behind. And people think that they need to do everything. I think Skillshare, masterclasses, everything has gone wild at the moment, because people thinking that that's how they can get a competitive advantage. Then close second was, so that's 40%. Close second is changing working practices to optimize human intelligent automation, 35%. And I think this one's really interesting, 30%, embracing uncertainty and complexity. So that is that adaptability, making the most out of the opportunities that these changes throw at us. And then 25% is improving digital literacy. Are they what you would have expected for the answers? Would you expect that the adopting new skills would be, the top skill?
Yeah, I'm not surprised by points 1 and 2 coming out. I think they're all. I think it's so important that we understand skills and training, and maybe that's something that's almost been exaggerated through the pandemic. But it's also something that's very often spoken about in the news again, and through many organizations. If we're looking for new business practices, to introduce new technologies, then clearly that's one of the things that we're going to need to do. For me, the standout response there was the 30% on embracing uncertainty and complexity. And I go back to what I said earlier on, that a lot of our organizations, they try to shield us from the reality of uncertainty and complexity. And we're often told, well, let's boil it down to something simple. And the reality is, no, it's complex. Let's at least acknowledge the complexity and the uncertainty. Okay, we may need to take it down to the little bits and pieces, but we do have to keep going back to that reality. And it's the kind of the reality thing that makes me think about the importance of foresight in helping us with these decisions. Because typically part of the certainty thing our organizations like to do is extrapolate from the trends from the past. But actually all we're doing is reinforcing those biases from the past. Foresight actually allows us to take a step back and say, what could radically be different? And then what we do is we join those plausible futures up with the trends that we see to see what makes sense and what doesn't. So that whole area of uncertainty and complexity, I think, is absolutely fascinating. And I really do think that's where foresight sits.
We talk about a lot as an organization enterprise skills, and they're the kind of softer skills, as well as some ones like digital literacy. They're the softer skills that go into successful entrepreneurship, or that business leaders are built of. So it's resilience, it's self-management, it's communication, but it's adaptability, it's being able to stay agile, to react to change. Do you think those soft skills are more important than ever? And it's actually a really firm basis of those soft skills can help you adopt some of the newer practices, like improving digital literacy, developing broader leadership skills, adopting kind of new technologies.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back really to what is it that will differentiate us in the future. And when I say differentiate us, I mean from other businesses as much as anything else. If you think about it, if we all adopt the same kinds of technologies, then our basic products and services all look very similar. You could argue the same has already happened in the automotive sector, where the major difference is the badge on the front of the car, not necessarily what's underneath it. When you look at the common components there are, for example, between a Skoda, an Audi and a Volkswagen, and yet they all have different price points. So the differentiation, I think, comes on the relationships that we form with customers and clients. It comes on that the additional things that we can do to help them in the context of the products and the services that we provide. It helps us think about new different models, for example, new subscription models, because actually access to the data and how I use that data and the services around that, which could be human led, are more important than the piece of hardware that I actually use. So I do think that those softer skills are incredibly important, and they are going to be the skills that will be the last, if ever, to be automated.
Oh, I think that's so interesting. And I think for a long time, people have favored harder skills and the softer skills had a bit of a bad time. But, I think the pandemic showed us anything is those softer elements of life, they're more kind of emotional, touchy-feely things, you could say, have been the things that we all crave and that we all miss, and that digital technology can't deliver or fulfill, that need in the same way.
Yeah, quite agree. At the end of it, whatever we do with technology and whatever situation we're in through lockdown during the pandemic, it's actually the things that make us people and human that are the first things that we miss.
Absolutely. So I think we have sort of run over a bit, but I think we can sort of take another 5 minutes and maybe have a look at some of these things that people expect to come out of the pandemic, which are the opportunity areas for business. So Dean says, sort of already up prior to the pandemic, I was seeing streaming services go from strength to strength, with more coming onto the market, and hopefully better quality programming available too. So he thinks there'll be more opportunity for program makers and developers, etc. Do you think that's an opportunity area? That kind of that on-demand streaming service, whether it be in entertainment or in education?
Yeah, without a doubt, it's one of those trends by the pandemic. I think, like all of these sectors where we see that acceleration, if we've got more people piling into the marketplace, then the dynamics of that marketplace is going to be quite volatile for some time. Some of those people piling into the marketplace will fail. Other people piling into the marketplace will succeed. How they'll differentiate themselves, I think, is going to be quite interesting. One of the things that might change is the price point. And the price point, I think, has already started to change with some of those. So if we think, for example, about a traditional Sky subscription model, and we compare that to a Netflix subscription model, we can already see that coming, pre-pandemic, there was this kind of price point difference in those subscription services. And if we think about almost any marketplace, the more providers of products and service there are, the cheaper the individual product and service is. So I think that's the interesting piece is, how will the economics work as people pile into a specific marketplace? But without a doubt, I think there are lots of areas where we'll see quite significant change and new people coming into the marketplace. We think about retail as another example. Then I have this concept in my head, which is already in place, really, of dark stores. So the more home delivery we take, the less we need big supermarkets. So you shrink supermarkets, you create dark stores or automated warehouses that actually do an automated pick, pack, and delivery. And if you think about how many of us are now taking delivery or click and collect, even through basic essentials, then that feels like that could be a trend that's been accelerated through the pandemic and will create different business models in future.
And that sort of answers Chris's, what Chris kind of suggests will come out of the pandemic. Delivery services, online platforms. He also says flexible work, there's office spaces. And I think delivery services, if we look at someone like Ocado, who last year before was having a really tough time, and their share price has shot through the roof in the last 3 months, we're seeing that being an incredibly efficient logistics company really pays at the moment, because people have changed their shopping behaviours. And what do you think about flexible work and office spaces? If people are going to be working from home more often, or it's become a new normal, do you think that there will be a need for people to kind of have that human contact with a flexible office space rather than those kind of 3,000 person glossy offices?
I mean, I go back to the point I made just now, which is being human, we do have, and I'm talking really generally now, we do have a need for social contact. So there needs to be some way to replace the social contact that we may have had in the workplace through other ways. That may be at work, or it may be something that we do differently in our private lives. The idea of kind of the 3,000 person plush office, I think, despite the number of cranes that you see around London at any point, that's a really interesting notion going forward, because all the trends seem to point to a requirement for less office space, given that many of those office-based administrative jobs right now are the next tranche of jobs that will be automated, be that finance, be that insurance. There are all sorts of different admin type jobs, white collar type jobs, that are ripe for automation now. And I think one of the things that will lead us to do as we think about investment in real estate in the future is look at how we repurpose those assets. So can we transfer the use of redundant office space into new living space, into residential space? Now, the interesting thing about that is, if a certain level of living accommodation becomes part of universal base, actually the trend there could create the mechanism that we might need to eradicate homelessness and the housing crisis. Now, obviously, it needs a different funding model, and it needs a different approach in government in order to do that. But that's one of the potential scenarios that I can see in the future that could emerge, not just as a result of the technological trends, but also almost the kind of the tipping point that this current pandemic has represented.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think perhaps that's an opportunity area for young people. It is in that kind of shift in the way we work, is looking at how they can be involved in that, because essentially they are going to be, coming into the workplace, and they can be responsible for the changes that they want to see, and what they look like.
Yeah, and I think that's a really crucial phase to me, about how we think about things going forward, and this kind of notion of leadership. It's about our responsibility, not shifting that responsibility onto someone else. What is it that we can do with our mindset, our behavior, our approach, our learning, and how we then interact with people with that knowledge and with those skills. Absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. And Palmer said sort of cashless payments, which I think we're already seeing that cashless payments are huge. No one's, barely anyone's accepting cash at the moment. And I think it's a big thing as well for, young entrepreneurs, especially. Lots of people would have had historic marketplaces, would be a great place to, when we had bricks and mortar shops, it's a lot easier to kind of go to a marketplace, have some exchange of cash rather than have a premises. Even now, that sort of way of retail has shifted, and everyone in my local market on Friday, everyone has iZettles or other kind of cashless devices. So we're kind of seeing a shift there as well. And then I really like Stella's point is a closing one for us, because we have run over, but it's demand for strategic leadership. It's no longer acceptable just to keep your business ticking over. You need to be constantly challenging the status quo, and hand in hand with this will be the demand for strategic financial support, both in partnerships and in leadership. And a supplier-customer relationship will change to a partnership, rather than a traditional relationship we recognize now. And I find that very interesting in the kind of supplier-customer relationship, because we have seen that relationship is so important. It's not transactional. The way we're rallying for local businesses, the way that businesses are trying to look after us, whether it be through positive PR or real well-meaning, but we're also trying to look after them. So do you think that there's going to be shifts in the way that businesses being built going forward will change, in the way that they have that kind of a true, authentic customer business relationship?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing that. So I hesitate at the use of partnership in that respect, because to me, partnership is something that's actually quite different. Partnership is the result of coming together to address an issue of common interest, where we both invest something, both in the process and the outcome. I think that looking to create service and support that pays attention to the needs of the people that I want to buy that product and service, I think is something different to that, but I do think it's really different. I think the proposition is increasingly important around the brand as well. And that's where, particularly for younger consumers, the sustainability issue plays a big part. And that potentially even plays a big part in the choices that people might make about whether they fly, who they fly with, do they buy from, do they buy their clothes from a brand that is that has great sustainability credentials, you know, all that kind of thing. So I think the kind of the proposition around which a brand is developed, I think, will become critically important. I don't see it as a partnership, but I do see it as paying attention to the needs of the consumer and the client base, and that's not to make it any less important than it is. I just don't believe it's partnership.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. We are really at the end. We've pushed it, but I think everyone's still here, so that's brilliant. I'm about to share Steve's details and where to find him in the chat box. But Steve, from me, and before a big thank you, a last kind of question and piece of advice. If you were to start a business now, if you're an entrepreneur looking to make the most of this opportunity that this kind of challenge is throwing up, what would you do and what piece of advice would you give?
What would I do?
Put you on the spot.
Yeah, that's, we need another webinar for that, if I'm honest, Katie. But I mean, I think that I would absolutely start a new business right now. I would look, listen, and learn. I think those are the absolutely critical things. What are the things that I'm observing in the marketplace I want to operate that people are valuing? How do I think those things will change going into the future? And more importantly, how do I embrace some of these ideas around uncertainty, complexity, change, adaptability, to ensure that when the marketplace does change, because it will, that I'm prepared to change with it?
Yeah, I love that. So parting thoughts. Thank you so much, Steve. Look, learn, and listen. Take advantage of the opportunity and get excited about the future. So thank you so much, Steve. I've shared where you can find Steve in the registration box. Steve has got a book coming out, which I think you're just going to flick onto that page, which is Aftershocks and Opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah, so just very quickly, Aftershocks and Opportunities is an effort I've been working on with a company called Fast Future. It's a multi-author book, so we have about 28 chapters from futurists around the world, all looking at different perspectives about a post-pandemic future. So you can see the details on the screen there. You can go to my website to access it. And I will also provide Katie with a code which would allow you to pre-order a discounted copy of the book if you wish to. We've also got a day's webinar, literally a whole day, because our authors come from all over the world, on the 1st of June. So I'll share some details of that with Katie as well. And you'd be very welcome to come and listen to some of the authors talking about their chapters on the 1st of June. But thank you very much for listening. I hope that's really been useful for you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye. Bye, Steve.
Bye, everyone.